Welcome to the BankTalk podcast, the show where we talk to leaders and experts from the community banking sector. Whether you are a current CEO or aspire to be one, this podcast will give you valuable insights and advice on how to run your financial institution better. Each episode explores a new topic with a guest who brings their unique experience and knowledge. Tune in and discover something new each time you listen.
Hello, and welcome to BankTalk. I'm Jordan Kelly, your host and consultant at Remedy Consulting. Today, we're sitting down with Lee Wetherington, the Senior Director of Corporate Strategy at Jack Henry, to talk about the importance of data strategy, and open banking. In particular, we're talking about the regulatory challenges around the personal financial data rights, or the PFDR rule, which was first released in 2025. So without further ado, let's dive into our discussion. Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to join me this morning.
Happy to be here, Jordan.
All right, Lee, we're talking about a little bit of a meaty topic. We're talking about a hot topic today, revolving around this idea of open banking. But before we deep dive into it, can you give me a little bit of your background and your experience in this area?
Sure. Yeah. So at Jack Henry, I am Senior Director of Corporate Strategy. And what that means practically is I'm the big picture person on our strategy team. I work with a team of analysts, each of whom are deeply expert in all of the respective domains that comprise financial services, financial technology. They're doing deep dives and research and analysis and forecasting in their respective domains day in, day out. And I'm the person that comes in on top of all of that and connects the dots between those domains to find the patterns and the connections, and ultimately a framework for efficiently thinking about and talking about in accurate data-driven ways the larger, bigger picture, and then forecasting that forward in a 3 to 5 year frame so that we're constantly thinking about, revising, and making decisions about how we want Jack Henry to be positioned to help our clients win in the 3 to 5 year frame. So that, in short, is my day job at Jack Henry. And as a part of that, we use several different frameworks for doing our strategy work generally and our strategic foresight work specifically. And one of those frameworks is the PESO framework. So we're looking at what's happening in politics and the economy, society, which would include demographic shifts, technology, law, which for us would include also regulation, which is our bailiwick today, and then the environment. And so this topic on open banking and what's happening in the regulatory area generally is not just hot, it's fundamental in terms of really shaping winners and losers in the data-driven era that we're all entering. So whether you're talking about AI or analytics or automation or machine learning algorithms or now agents, you've got to have enough of the right data to do any of the most meaningful things with those different technologies going forward. So this is a really foundational, structural, and important topic for everybody.
Absolutely. And like you just mentioned, really at the basis of that is the data. So I would say at this point, everyone in the banking space, they know the importance of data. And I would say most financial institutions are primarily concerned about the amount of truly usable or actionable data that they have access to. So recently, the CFPB's Personal Financial Data Rights Rule, which implements Rule 1033, has drawn more attention to the issue. So in layman's terms, can you tell me a little bit, what is 1033 and the PFDR rule, and where does it stand today?
Yeah. So 1033 is shorthand for Section 1033 of the Dodd-Frank Act, right, which came out of the Great Recession of 2009. And what Section 1033 specifically establishes is that the account holder in a financial account situation owns his or her data. The bank doesn't own the data. The credit union doesn't own the data. The payments app doesn't own the data. Those entities, in terms of the PFDR rule, the Personal Financial Data Rights Rule that we're going to be talking about, those entities are known as data providers. In other words, they are hosting the financial data that is within scope for purposes of that PFDR rule. So what you've had is back in 2009, 2010, with Section 1033, we established by statute that you own your financial data and I own my financial data, and therefore, by the way, we should be able to share our data that we own with whomever we want for whatever purpose we want. And that means that if that data is sitting at a bank, the bank has to enable or to facilitate the sharing of that data that we permission to be done with a third party. And that third party might be a fintech. It might be our accountant, right? It might be, by the way, part of some, college financial loan application. It could be any number of things, but the data is ours and we should be able to share it with whomever we want. The real rub has been, what does that mean banks are on the hook to be able to do in terms of enabling that sharing? How much of a hook are they on? How much is it going to cost? Can they charge for and recuperate the costs involved in sharing that data that we permission out to third parties as account holders? Those are all the things that the CFPB's personal financial data rights rule was supposed to address and did address, by the way. And so one other piece of context on PFDR is that all of the different stakeholders who have so when we talk about stakeholders here, it is both data providers and then also data recipients, right? So if you're saying, hey, bank, I want to share my checking account transaction data with this third-party fintech, then the third-party fintech in that scenario is a data recipient. The bank is a data provider. But you could just as well actually request that fintech that may have some native data, transaction data that you've created with them independent of the bank and say, hey, you know what? Most of my transaction data is at the bank. Hey, fintech, I want to share the data that you have back to my bank so that I can have all of my or most of my transaction data in view, one pane of glass at my bank. And by the way, a lot of banks don't think that way. They only think in one direction. They think of this as a threat to their ability to have and hold your data and to do things with your data and to create value with and for you using your data. They're not often thinking on offense about all of the different data you have sitting at payment apps, neobanks, 529 accounts, 401ks, wealth techs, Coinbase, like all of these other disparate entities with whom average Americans have financial service relationships of one form or another. And just this is a really important point. So I'm going to say this up front because this will be foundational to our conversation. Average bank in the United States only has at best, about 20 to 25% of a customer's total financial data. And that's because of the state of financial fragmentation, which is to say the average American adult has relationships with between 15 and 20 different financial service providers. So if you're a bank who is still thinking kind of like we did 20 years ago, that I've got most of Jordan's financial data right here at the bank, I'm Jordan's primary financial service provider or primary bank relationship. So I've got most of what, Jordan has in terms of money and services and the data that comes off of that. You've got a huge and problematic blind spot relative to everything that matters going forward, because you don't have, not only do you not have all of Jordan's data, you don't have a preponderance of her data. You have a very small minority of her data. And if you're wanting to do the most interesting and compelling things going forward with AI and all these other things I just mentioned a moment ago, you need a preponderance of data. And so the question becomes, how can I plug data deficits on Jordan that I have on Jordan? And how can I do that? How can I get her permission to allow me as the bank to aggregate the data, the transactional data sitting at all of those disparate financial service providers and apps she's using kind of on the side? How do I get her permission to bring that data back to bank? And that's what's in scope for PFDR is how does that work? How do we structure getting permission? And of course, for purposes of compliance, documenting that permission that we got from Jordan to either share her data out or share or aggregate data she has elsewhere back to bank. How do we manage all of that? What is the art and science of permissioning, of actually getting a consent from Jordan to hopefully aggregate data back to bank more than necessarily just always getting permission or enabling the share out of her data to third parties.
So there's actually something that you alluded to kind of at the beginning of that explanation, which is so the original PFDR rule went into effect in January 2025, I believe.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And it has since faced quite a few challenges by the Trump administration.
That's putting it lightly, Jordan.
I mean, there's even been, a series of lawsuits by both banks and various fintech trade groups, both for and against it.
Right. That's right.
So, in the midst of all of these regulatory challenges, would you say is the pressure still on banks and bank tech providers like Jack Henry? Is the pressure still there?
That's a really interesting question, and it depends on who you're posing that question to. So I'll speak for Jack Henry for a moment. We've been anticipating this moment of having a structured approach, a standardized approach to the exchange of financial data in the United States. We've been not only anticipating it, we've been helping precipitate it because we understand that data is at the base of everything, right? No data, no AI. No data, really no efficiency, because you can't, there's so many things that you need, not just the right data to do, but the right data in the right format, available on the right modern architecture to be able to make the biggest gains in efficiency and to drive growth, et cetera. But PFDR specifically has been, I was talking about those stakeholders earlier. This is not just like a 2025 thing or a 2024 thing. Those stakeholders, in concert with several different regimes at the CFPB over the course of the last 6 to 7 years, all had a hand in compromising to get to that first official form of the personal financial data rights rule that went into effect on January 17, 2025. And so there's a lot of vested interest in that. Now, back to Jack Henry, we have seen this coming for quite a while. We believe in standards. We believe in interoperability because that lifts all boats. We are on the board, or we're a member of FDX, which is a standards provider for financial data exchange in the United States, and I would say the predominant one at the moment. The CFPB did, by the way, bless officially FDX as an acceptable financial data exchange standard at the end of last year, that is 2025. And so we've been on this for a while. In fact, I just want to give a shout out to a colleague of mine because his name does not get mentioned a lot. But I feel like if there's a Hall of Fame of open banking, he's in it. His name's Chad Killingsworth, and he heads all of engineering at Jack Henry. But he personally architected the biggest open banking integration in the history of the industry when he brought over 1,000 financial institutions that sit on our digital platform, Banno, plumbed them all of them into all of the major financial data exchanges. By the way, so who are those, right? Those are Plaid and Finicity, MX. You can throw Intuit in there. Akoya, which is the big bank aggregation platform, and he architected plumbing our digital platform and those 1,000 financial institutions into the open banking infrastructure by way of secure and standardized APIs. And he did that almost 3 years ago for several purposes. One is to increase security, because right now what you have without standardized open banking APIs, what you have is this terrible thing that we've been calling screen scraping forever, that opens up and continues to be a problem, by the way, in terms of opening up a series of threat vectors, cyber attacks, all kinds of different problems with people pretending to be entities that they are not, all of that kind of thing, because because there's no way to really vet screen scraping in a standardized way to ensure that, wait, did Jordan really say that it was okay for the screen scraper to come in at 3 a.m. and grab these transactions from the bank and take it out to fintech X, Y, or Z, or not? Like, that's literally, and you can imagine that this is like thousands and millions like of these things going on every minute in the United States. So again, to give props to my buddy Chad, it's unbelievable. He plumbed all of these financial institutions into the open banking infrastructure by way of standardized APIs so that there is now an ended inbound screen scraping for all of those financial institutions, and therefore ended all of the different exposure in terms of cyber fraud and that kind of thing. And ended, by the way, when you end screen scraping, it effectively means that your account holders should no longer ever be giving their username and password for their bank login to any third party for any reason. Why? You have these standardized direct APIs that negotiate all of that without you doing this really dumb and stupid thing of giving your username and password to a third party, to the crown jewels, to your money, to your accounts, to your transactions. So when you're asking this question about whether there's more or less urgency in the moment, if you're us, we want the industry to catch up. We want these standards really to be ubiquitous and for everybody to benefit from the same things that I've just described were made a benefit for the financial institutions on our digital platform when Chad did all of that 3 years ago, or orchestrated all of that 3 years ago. So my concern right now, and by the way, there's also always this issue or concern about, there's two. One we've already talked about is that we're just going to, as the bank, end up seeing a lot of our data just go out, right, to third parties. And that's terrible. And that's a competitive concern and an attrition risk and all of those things. And then the other concern, and this is mostly theoretical, because again, we had a rule in January, and then suddenly we didn't have an effective rule because of the new administration coming in and creating all kind of havoc. The diplomatic way we are just talking about that today is regulatory volatility, but the way I've been describing it for the balance of 2025 is dysregulation over and against deregulation. Everybody wants deregulation, right? Smart deregulation based on size and complexity of bank. Everybody wants that. That's a great thing. That's good for everybody, right? But what we've been seeing is really politically motivated dysregulation, which is to say, just cut and destroy for the sake of cutting and destroying, and we'll figure out what the consequences of that are later. CFPB is a great example of that. CFPB, by the way, no longer supervises fintechs, which are banks, by the way, biggest competitors, whether they realize it or not, Jordan. And maybe you've talked about that on other episodes of your forecast. It's not the other bank down the street or the credit union, by the way, down the street. It is this cohort of direct to consumer fintechs that are now capturing over 43% of all consumer switch flow, which is a term used to describe, what types of financial service entities are capturing either individuals that are net new to banking. So we talk about like Gen Alpha, Gen Z, or are capturing switch, like when people are switching from one financial service provider to another. Fintechs now capture over 43% of consumer switch flow in financial services. Community banks are capturing less than 3%. So, if you're a bank and you still think you're competing against the bank down the street or the credit union down the street, that's another really big, massive blind spot that you have to redress. But urgency gets down to perception here. So my fear is that what people don't, if it all depends on how you see or think about or feel relative to open banking. If you think open banking is this thing that originated in Europe and is now finally being foisted on us by the big, nasty federal regulatory apparatus, et cetera, and you're on defense, you think this is all threat to you, then you're glad that there's all this chaos and that there's now no longer a first, second, or third wave effective date for PFDR now that it's in limbo, right? The problem is that while you are feeling no urgency because of the regulatory chaos, all of your most progressive and concerning competitors realizes this is exactly the time that they want to be getting to that preponderance of data on your customers so that they can begin providing value that you are not providing now, and or by the time you wake up to what has happened, the fact that you've lost these cold wars in data gathering because you thought you didn't have to worry about it because you're just waiting for some regulator to tell you there's a rule that you need to comply with. You're now facing an existential threat, not just am I in compliance or not, and how much will this cost or not. Back to that, by the way, that's the other fear. It's conceptual: is how much is this going to cost to comply? Let's say even with the first version of PFDR that went into effect last year, how much would it cost? Well, what we did at Jack Henry is we did all that plumbing into the open, between our digital platform and the open banking providers or the financial data exchanges. We did all that plumbing and we just baked it in. There's no cost or no lift. It just happened. And we negotiated all that. And we did that because, we're Jack Henry and we are the tech stack underneath literally thousands of financial institutions. So we levered that weight to go to the mat with Plaid, with Akoya, with Finicity, with MX, with Intuit, by the way, with Stripe, et cetera. And we got all that plumbing done, and we did it without any cost or lift to those banks that are on our digital platform. The real question becomes, when you have to start doing the data sharing methodically per whatever final rule we may or may not get, there is a cost to that. There is a cost to maintaining the APIs and the bandwidth in your cloud infrastructure to entertain API calls for permission data sharing requests and tracking all of that. There is a cost to that. And that's one of the things I think we still might get a revised version of PFDR. And one of those revisions is probably going to be an allowance for banks to recoup some of their cost in enabling this, something akin to an interchange fee in the card world. It's not, hey, you can just charge whatever you want. It would be great, though, if we had some kind of understanding that, yes, for everybody to benefit, because everybody is going to benefit, those data providers like banks that are going to have to maintain the APIs and the calls for data to share out, but also to aggregate back, those data providers should receive some kind of, cost recouping fee for that. Nothing to make money on or to build a business model on, but literally just to recoup costs. That would be really healthy, I think, for the entire ecosystem in the United States. And I still have fairly high hopes that we will get a revised version, and that will be a net positive change in that revised version of PFDR.
We'll be right back.
Ever feel like your tech budget's running the show instead of supporting it? You're not alone. Between bloated vendor contracts and outdated systems, a lot of banks are stuck paying more for less. And here's the kicker. Those big tech vendors, their contracts are built to protect them, not you. So if you're hesitating to make bold moves because of tech costs, it's time to flip the script. That's where Remedy Consulting comes in. We help banks take back control, cutting through the fine print, optimizing spend, and finding tech solutions that actually fuel growth. And we're offering a free review of your tech stack, spending, and vendor contracts. No pressure, no sales pitch, just expert insight to help you make smarter decisions. Even if we're not the right fit, you'll walk away with clarity and confidence. So go to remedyconsult.net or call 206-295-5776. Let's make your tech work for you, not against you. Thanks for listening to the BankTalk podcast.
So what's kind of interesting about what I just heard from you, Lee, is to recap a little bit, if the urgency isn't necessarily there today from the regulatory side, that doesn't mean that the urgency has gone away or that the pressure is not on. I think in many cases, not simply in, the world of banking, but I think a lot of times regulatory oversight follows action. And what we're seeing here, what I'm kind of hearing from you here, is that now is the time to be taking that action because maybe the regulation doesn't come in the next year. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But by the time it catches up, the expectation should be for banks, credit unions, fintechs that they are already on this, this data journey.
Yeah. I think the best way to summarize, and now I wish I would have thought about this at the beginning of my very long answer to your previous question, is that there is absolute strategic urgency around having a data strategy and the technology in place to execute that data strategy. Why? To plug the massive data deficits that average banks have on their existing customers. If you've only got 20% or 25% of your customers' data now on hand natively inside the bank, that means you've got a 75% data deficit to plug or mostly plug. Now, no one's ever going to get to 100% of having 100% of all of their customers' data sitting at the bank, regardless of whether or not it's native to the bank or not. But you can certainly, through open banking, API-based aggregation with permission, you can certainly get to the preponderance of data on your customers. And when you get to that preponderance, several things happen. First of all, now you actually know Jordan. Thinking that having only 25% of Jordan's money information on hand to reference gives you a full picture of who Jordan is and what really matters to her is not just presumptuous. It's like laughable. And if you think that you can start, use your little 25% of data you have on Jordan, feed it into a model that's then going to recommend, next best product or service to Jordan, at the bank. I mean, you're going, when you do that, imagine what comes out of that, Jordan. I have 25% of your data. I feed it to a model, and the model's now going to say, "Hey, Jordan, we recommend that you need product X because we see that you don't have product X." Now, immediately, you're going to get that recommendation, and you're going to know, wait a minute, what do you mean I need product X? I have that over at this other financial institution that I have a relationship with. Wait a minute, why are you recommending that I need things that I already have? Oh, you don't really know me.
Mm-hmm.
So I tell banks to tread very carefully here with having any kind of sort of arrogance about what you can do with the relatively small amount of transaction data you have on your customers like Jordan. Don't make the mistake of trying to execute on use cases without the requisite data to do them, right? And this is why open banking is such a big deal, because if let's talk about this. I think that the winners of the data wars are going to be those who master the art and ultimately compliance of securing data permissions. Now, the beautiful thing that banks have working in their favor is they, by and large, are still very much more trusted than a lot of these third-party little payment apps and Neos and other things that a lot of us use by default. Not a lot, but we all use them tangentially, typically. And so this is the window in which to lever trust that banks have been building and earning for decades. Because Jordan is much more likely to say yes to an aggregation permission nudge from the bank through a digital channel or mobile app than she is over here for a payments app like Venmo that she uses every once in a while to pay somebody for whatever because they also have the Venmo app, right? Are you more apt to say yes to Venmo wanting to aggregate all of your bank and other transaction data there, or vice versa? No, I've got, a lot of my primary checking account is here. Most of my activities here. I'd like to see everything in one pane of glass. So this is what banks need to capitalize on, is getting really good and strategic and thoughtful on how to ask Jordan for permission to aggregate data back to bank, to begin building to the preponderance of data they need on Jordan. And I would tell you that the first, and by the way, we've done consumer research to this effect to look at what different demographics and different psychographics, how receptive or not they are to saying yes to a data permission or data aggregation request, depending on who's asking and what's being asked specifically. Because you can't just say, can we just get some data for no reason? You have to state the reason. So if your bank, if you were to get a message, Jordan, from your bank that said, a nudge that said, hey, Jordan, we see from your transaction activity that you've got accounts at PayPal and Venmo, and it looks like Cash App and maybe Coinbase and blah, 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 blah. Would it be helpful if you were able to see all of that here in one place? If so, we would be happy to aggregate that data back here so that you could see it without having to log into all of these disparate apps for 3 seconds. By the way, 3 seconds, did you know that? That's an official number. That's the amount of time that the average American spends in any one of those 14 financial apps on average that they have on their phone. And they're doing that just to see, how much money do I have in this one? How much money do I have in this one? How much money do I have in this one? So, Jordan, this is your bank speaking. Would you like for us to take that nonsense away and just give you a window into all of this other transaction activity and balances and money that you have in these disparate apps? And you're probably going to say yes, but that's not where the request ends. We can do that and you will get that benefit, Jordan, but we're asking to do this so that we can better identify and protect you against fraud on your account, so that we can better and quicker detect anomalies in and on your account so that we can stop them before any damage is done. Would that be okay, Jordan? Literally, this is the consent request. Is that okay? Would you be okay with that? And look, we know, because we've done the research, Jordan is going to say, yes, please, like yesterday, do that. Okay, so now they aggregate all of that data. The bank aggregates all of that data back. You've got now a fairly full, replete window of all of your financial activity and money across all those disparate providers here in the pane of glass digitally that your bank is providing you. And they're now better able to protect you against fraud. So now the art comes in, which is maybe 2 months later or 3 months later. Hey, Jordan, you remember hopefully you're enjoying all of that data that you're able to see in one place. And we're using that to better protect you against fraud. Would it be okay if we use this data to help recommend and hyper-personalize recommendations to you on next, we would say next best product or service. I wouldn't use that language in the request, but it would be so that we can help you figure out like what the next best choice for you is relative to your money, and also maybe even benchmark against peers, people that are like you and in your part of the particular financial life cycle. And because you've already said yes to the first request, what is your chances of saying yes to the second request? It's just an additional benefit with data that they're already aggregating on your behalf. Well, that's a no-brainer. You're gonna say yes, please. So my point is that the most progressive players who are on offense are already building out what I've just described to you. Okay. But if you're a bank saying, oh, I'm glad Trump is causing chaos and I don't now have a deadline for PFDR, so I can just put this off indefinitely, while you're sitting back, the most progressive banks you're competing against, and by the way, the fintechs that you should be most worried about, are absolutely putting together and beginning to execute on data strategies that help them ask first and best for permission to aggregate data back to them and away from you. And that's where, if there is urgency, it's with those people who know that and are acting on it. Everybody else is, again, in their normal compliance posture, which is to say, I'm not doing diddly until somebody says I have to do diddly by X deadline.
Until I have to do it.
Yeah.
So let me ask you something. So Jack Henry does an annual survey. So I read in Jack Henry's annual survey that a majority of CEOs consider their financial institutions to be a fast follower.
Yes, right.
Give me a little bit of a little detail around that. Like what does it mean to be a fast follower? And from your perspective, from Jack Henry's perspective, would you consider most of your banks to be in that fast follower category, or would you say that there's a discrepancy between bankers' perceptions and, your perception?
There is a very big discrepancy between what what it means and is to be a fast follower today versus what that meant and what was possible 20 years ago versus today. So 20 years ago, I would say, yeah, I put this question, by the way, in our benchmark last year. And it's one it gets asked in other similar surveys. But I wanted to ask it because I wanted to raise this issue and this question about what it means or whether it's even possible to be a fast follower in this window we're in now, meaning that the window into a data-driven era of financial services. This window that is a precursor to a brand new hybrid ecosystem of fiat and cryptographic monetary networks, payment systems, financial services having to come together, and banks having to navigate that, actually play a new game in that context. Because, and this gets back to what we're talking about here with data. Yeah, 20 years ago, it was fairly easy to be a fast follower because most of the technology you were using to run the bank was monolithic. It was, it was safe. It was steady. It was reliable. But it couldn't change much. Literally, architecturally, it couldn't change very fast, which was totally fine because we're a hyper-regulated industry. And we're hyper-regulated because money is at stake, and money is really important. And the whole point of having a hyper-regulated infrastructure is so that things don't change very fast, and you minimize the risk of things changing too fast and people getting hurt in mass and at scale, right? You look at what happened with Synapse in the embedded banking or banking as a service context, last year, and the fallout from that when you don't have a tight regulatory apparatus around how that works and who's responsible when suddenly millions of dollars goes missing because there's shoddy accounting and too much complexity and third-party providers between the actual systems of record at banks and then these accounting ledgers that are sitting over here in middleware layers, like et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, for most of my working career, and I've been at it for 30 years or so, most of my working career, it was easy to be a fast follower because things didn't move fast. The technology didn't move fast. Regulation wouldn't allow you to move fast. Therefore, it's easy when things are really, really slow. It's easy to be a fast follower, is my point, right? Now you fast forward to today and look at what's happening around us. So data has changed everything. AI is changing everything on top of data in terms of how you can do things, create new value, do things more efficiently, do things that were never before possible in a cost-efficient way. That is, create new value, capture value, all this kinds of stuff. And by the way, at the same time, we're going from a fiat-based monetary environment to one that has to now be interoperable with on-chain financial services and payments. And the bridge for that is some form of tokenized value, stablecoins, tokenized deposits, deposit tokens. You got all of this change. And so here you are in your bank and you've only got 25% of your customers' data. And so our CEOs, we knew this was going to happen because we see it everywhere else. More 60% of them, over 60% of them said, yeah, we're a fast follower. Yeah, we're not on the bleeding edge, but they certainly, it doesn't feel good to say we're a laggard, right? Even if you are. So they say, yeah, we're a fast follower. We wait and see what works, then we jump on it. Well, 20 years ago, that's the way it worked. If you're at a conference and you see that banks X, Y, and Z have done something really, really, really cool and they're having success with it, you go, let's just go talk to that vendor, buy that thing off the shelf and put it in in play at the bank. Okay, great. Today, the things that the banks are seeing that are really, really compelling are these unbelievable things that you can do either in the back office or even in the digital interface using different, what we call software 2.0 or LLM-based software development and models on the back end. Okay, great. So if you see that sexy LLM-based thing that banks X, Y, and Z are doing, you go, well, let's just go to that vendor or vendors, whoever that is, and just go buy that thing and put it in the bank. No. That's not how it works now. You want to do that thing, and you actually look into how banks X, Y, and Z did that. You realize that, oh my gosh, do we have the data to feed the LLM to do the sexy AI-based thing that those other banks are doing? Almost all banks will quickly realize, oh, no, we don't. We don't have the requisite data. In fact, not only do we not have enough of the right data, even the data that we have on Jordan, for instance, it is broken up and into across lots of different silos and systems of record that we put together at the bank just to provide whatever it is that we provide to Jordan. So first thing is we've got to acknowledge we've got to get the data out of these silos. We got to unify the data out of these silos into one place, and that might be a data warehouse, that might be a data lake. By the way, it might be a data lake house. You got to unify what data you do have. You then got to clean it. You've got to normalize it, right? You got to standardize it, basically, so that you got to get it into a form that is available and can be fed or streamed real time into an LLM that is going to do this special magical use case for your customers that you saw at these other very, very progressive banks. Question, Jordan, is how much time does that take? And the answer is it does not happen fast. All that stuff I just described, when you realize it's not just a thing that you plug in off the shelf, you've got to have the requisite data to do these most compelling things now. And almost all banks do not have the requisite data. Even the biggest banks don't have usually a preponderance. They have a higher percentage of total financial data on their customers just because of the broad span of their portfolio and products and services. But they don't have a preponderance either. But it's much easier for them to plug a 40% data deficit on their customers versus a community bank having to plug an 80% deficit on Jordan, if that makes sense. So if you get that bigger picture, it does give urgency to act now, irrespective of when, if, and in what form we get a final version of a revised PFDR or not. No data, no AI. So it should not be a reason to sit on your hands and pretend that there is not strategic urgency here when there absolutely is for everybody.
So actually, kind of final question for you, because I think that really leads me into, let's say, regardless of whether a final or revised version of PFDR goes into effect in the near future, in the distant future, I do think most FI leaders, they are always looking to meet or exceed, even just the consumer expectations, which are continuing to evolve. We know that's going to continue to happen. But so if I'm a banker, how can I keep up with consumer expectations about their data or, in your perspective? Because as you said over and over, that the data gathering is really the first step and the most important step. What's the first step into that realm if I'm somebody who thinks I'm starting from, maybe not starting from zero, but I'm starting my journey?
Yeah. So the answer to that is consumers have no expectations about data. They don't think about data. They just want they just want things to be easy and clear. And if you can do it for me, great. This is why, in a longer frame, in a 5 to 10 year frame, we should all be very, very concerned about what the potential and possibilities are for agents to disintermediate the relationship between the bank and those customers. Why? Because what does an agent do? An agent is just hopefully, if done right, an objective third-party entity, right? In this case, an AI, an intelligence, representing several different LLMs in operation behind that agent. And you're saying, hey, go out and find, you could ask open-ended questions like, I'm going to give you agent. I'm going to give you access to all of my financial service providers. And then I want you to come back to me with recommendations on what I should do next. And then the agent comes back with recommendations. I think you should do 1, 2, and 3 next. Great. All right, let's start with 1. Go out and find me the best deal on 1 and come back to me and let me know what you find. Agent does that. And then it's like, you know what? Okay, do that. Go ahead and do that. Make that happen. I'll get that product going for me, or I want that service, or I want that aggregation, or I want to see everything in one place, or whatever the case may be. So when you're asking the question about how do banks keep up with consumer expectations relative to data, again, they don't think about data at all. They just think about what's convenient. They also, it's law of least effort. This is basic human behavior 101. What consumers are beginning to awaken to is that the way we got to this fragmented, oh my gosh, I've got 14 financial apps on my phone, and I've got most of my sort of day-to-day transactional stuff at my bank, but then I've got all these other things. What they're realizing is that it sucks to have to log into 14 different apps for 3 seconds to get a thumbnail of where you are with your money. And if you can convince them at the bank that, hey, you know what, let us take that away. Let us take that inconvenience away and bring all this data back here. And by the way, this will make you safer. We can see if anybody's trying to, perpetrate fraud on you much quicker. And we can just, by the way, neutralize it automatically. Would you like that? They're going to say yes. And this is why I think all of this gets back to the art and science of consents and permissions relevant to the data to give these very conspicuous benefits to these human beings, which is just make my life simpler and better and easier. Data is the way, data is the only way you can do that in the context of a complex and fragmented financial services environment and experience generally for all Americans. So this all gets back to the same point. Now I'm beginning to repeat myself, which is data is at the foundation of everything. You've got to have enough of it to create value, real value that average people can see and feel and experience, right? They don't care about the data underneath and how that's happening. They just want the end outcome. And if you can key on that and start putting together a data strategy that gets you there for your customers and gets your customers there, that's all that really matters. But if you're using the regulatory chaos we're in at the moment to sit on your hands and think, oh, good, I don't have to think about financial data or a data strategy for another couple of years until I have some kind of compliance deadline, maybe from a final version of PFDR, you are hyper vulnerable to becoming not just not a fast follower, but so far behind that you can't catch up. And that's my biggest concern for banks right now at the moment relative to PFDR, the data environment, and everything it underpins.
Well, Lee, thank you so much for joining this today because you and I talked about a little bit. I think that this is a really important area. I think this is an area with potentially some confusion or maybe even just some scary elements if I am a community banker. But I also think it's a very important topic for not only for education, but as we had said earlier, really kind of shaping those strategies and goals in the next 3, 5, and 10 years.
For sure. And I would say, just to give practical next step advice and to end on that, you want to ask your digital banking provider, because by the way, all the data that is in scope for PFDR is sitting in the digital banking layer with where also authentication lies. So it's all mediated through the digital banking layers. A lot of people think it has to go all the way to the core. No, it absolutely does not. So my practical advice is, if you don't have a clear understanding, an explicit understanding from your digital banking provider about how much or how fully they are plumbed into all of the different major financial data exchanges, which is to say the plumbing of open banking in the United States, that's the first thing you want to know. The second thing you want to know is, okay, assuming that your digital banking platform is plumbed into all of those providers, what is my option for being able to aggregate data back to the bank with my customer's permission? What is the cost of that? how can I scale that? How do I secure permissions, document permissions, manage permissions in and around that? Again, you don't have to wait on PFDR. I would recommend that it's strategically dumb to do so. But that's where you should start. A conversation, a very candid conversation with your digital banking provider about where they are, what they can do, how you can aggregate using standardized open banking APIs back to bank. It's always a two-way street, right? You want to enable sharing out if that was the request, but you also want to be nudging and asking for permission to aggregate back to get to that preponderance of data so that you're in a position to win these cold data wars that are heating up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Really appreciate all of the information, but also even just your experience and your perspective on this. I appreciate
Yeah, happy to be here, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That's it for Bank Talk. Thank you for listening today. Have a good day and keep on learning.
Thank you for joining us on the Bank Talk podcast brought to you by Remedy Consulting. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please rate, review, and share our work with others. To stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to follow the show and turn on notifications. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.